Last week, Hunwei introduced us to Paul's letter to Titus. And this week, as Rui said, we're looking at the next 4 verses 5 to 9. And we're going to be looking in detail at the instruction that Paul gives to Titus, and indeed God gives to us, which is to appoint elders that will lead the church to godliness and bless the fellowship. So we've just heard the passage being read out. Let's remind ourselves of the context in which this passage is written. So Titus has been left in Crete to further Paul's work there. After setting up a new church, Paul is not with Titus. Paul's off on other missions, probably to establish new churches like the one that they have done in Crete. So Titus is on his own, and the church is struggling. And we find out later in the letter that the Cretan church contains rebels, deceivers, and false teachers. And we know from Paul's introduction, the passage that we heard last week, that Paul thinks it is of the utmost importance to be writing to Titus, giving him these instructions. And the instructions that he gives that we're going to be looking at tonight, but also throughout the rest of the book. So Paul tells us in chapter 1, verse 1, we're going to go back a little bit just to set the scene, that he is writing to Titus for the faith of God's elect and their knowledge of the truth that leads to godliness. Well, we're reading from the NIV version, our church Bible, but as we go through, I'm going to reference the ESV, the English Standard Version of the Bible, and the reason that I'm going to do that is just because there's some language in there that is different, but it helps to understand Paul's message in more detail, but also, as I found looking and preparing this, also gives some insight into the urgency in which he's giving these instructions. So, the ESV says, for the sake of the faith of God's elect. Now, Paul's not writing to give a few tips and tricks as how things can be better in Crete. But when you say for the sake of something, you're saying for the survival of it, or to ensure that a result is achieved. And in this case, in this letter from Paul to Titus, he feels he has to give these instructions for the sake of the faith of God's elect and their knowledge of the truth, which accords with godliness or leads to godliness, or their knowledge of and living out of the gospel truth. So chapter 1, verse 5 gives us Paul's first instruction to Titus. Of all the instructions that will follow, it starts here. If you look at verse 5, it says, "The reason I left you in Crete was that you might straighten out what was left unfinished and appoint elders in every town as I directed you." And that leads us on to our first point this evening, which is to appoint leaders with godly characteristics, not human talents. This is verses 5 to 8. So Paul reminds Titus that he left him in Crete to straighten out what was left unfinished and appoint elders in every town. He then goes on with a specific criteria or qualifications for Titus to use to select these elders. And as we read through it, will become clear it centers around finding and appointing men with the right characteristics to serve God and serve the church. And this is really important because it's Paul's key message, the first message, get the leaders right first. It's a bit like that saying, no ship goes to sea without a captain. You start by putting the right leaders in place. You get them in place first, you start as you mean to go on. So who should the church appoint as leaders? Well, this is what Paul says. Look at verse 6. I'm going to read on to verse 8. An elder must be blameless, faithful to his wife, a man whose children believe and are not open to the charge of being wild and disobedient. Since an overseer is entrusted with God's work, he must be blameless, not overbearing, not quick-tempered, not given to drunkenness, not violent, not pursuing dishonest gain. Rather, he must be hospitable, one who loves what is good, who is self-controlled, upright, holy, and disciplined. Now, when it comes to appointing church leaders, the qualifications or the criteria is based on characteristics and heart attitudes, like we mentioned. And I was thinking as I was preparing this, does that ring true for what our society is looking for in leaders today? It doesn't say anything in the passage about human talents such as natural-born leader or eloquent with a wonderful way of words, popular and well respected among peers, successful with a nice house and a talent for making money. These are the kind of things that society might be looking for in leaders. Well, God says, no, that's not what I'm looking for. In fact, the list of qualifications given is a reflection of the characteristics that present godliness. They are the behaviors of those who you see living out the gospel. Well, Paul is saying that the elders that are appointed must be an example of this godliness to the church. Now, some of you may have fallen victim to the famous parenting cop-out of do as I say, not as I do. Well, that's not the kind of leadership that Paul says the church needs. Paul's list of godly qualifications for church leadership allow for elders to say, well, do as I say, but look what I do. Follow my example of living in accordance with the gospel. And this, of course, is the example set to us by Jesus. It's the characteristics, it's the godliness that we saw in Jesus' life on earth. So let's think about this in context of the original reader. Titus chapter 1, skip ahead to next week or week after. Titus chapter 1, verse 10 says, "For there are many rebellious people full of meaningless talk and deceptions." Verse 12, "Cretans are always liars, evil brutes, lazy gluttons." Well, that's a stark contrast, isn't it, to the list of the criteria that Paul gives us. If you're part of the church in Crete and you're looking around you, you're not seeing much godliness in your leaders, especially. To lead is to show the way. And that's why Paul's first instruction to Titus is to appoint the right leaders, especially those who show godliness in their lives. So how can we apply this? Well, although this criteria is godly behavior and it's for the appointing of elders, are these characteristics not an embodiment of the godliness that we should all be striving for? Is this not living out the gospel? 1 John chapter 1 verse 6 says this, "If we claim to have fellowship with him and yet walk in the darkness, we lie and do not live out the truth." We shouldn't be reading this part of Titus and saying, well, I'm not in a leadership position, so actually it doesn't apply to me. This is God's list of characteristics for his overseers, as it says in verse 7. And whether that's as an elder or in youth work or as a small group leader or in set-up teams, this is the godliness that Paul talks about in chapter 1 and throughout the rest of the letter to Titus. And of course, we're going to look at that in more detail over the next few weeks. But coming back to our key message, appoint elders that will lead the church to godliness and bless the fellowship. Yes, we should absolutely be striving for godliness. And the elders of the church should be leading us in their example of this. So we're going to break and look at our first set of questions. Hopefully that will prompt some good discussion. And then I'll be coming back up to talk about verse 9 on its own and look in a bit more detail at the role of the elders in the church and why that is so necessary. So the question should come up. Yeah, there we go. And I'm back in a minute. We're going to move on to our second point this evening, which is that elders are the protectors of sound doctrine in the church. This we're looking at verse 9 now. This is the final two instructions that Paul gives to Titus for when appointing leaders. Verse 9 says, "An elder must hold firm to the trustworthy word as taught, so that he can encourage others in it and refute those who oppose it." Well, this is a crucial job of an elder and something that Paul refers back to at different points in Titus. Paul opens his letter by Titus, if you remember, in verse 1, to further the faith of God's elect and their knowledge of the truth which leads to godliness. Because Paul knows that many people in Crete have strayed away from the gospel truth. And this is why Paul says that elders need to hold firm to the trustworthy message. Hold firm, persist, do not stray from the trustworthy message, the gospel, the word of God. Why is this instruction so important? Paul says that this is so elders can encourage others by sound doctrine. English Standard Version uses the word exhort, which means to strongly encourage or urge someone to do something. The elders need to be able to instruct or exhort the church based on the word of God, so that God's elect, us, don't get led astray from that trustworthy message. We stick to the gospel. This is especially important as our society, like the Cretan society back then, is full of opposing messages, false teachers and deceivers. I referenced chapter 1, verse 10, and we'll hear more about this in a couple of weeks' time. But Paul says, "For there are many full of meaningless talk and deceptions." There are false teachers causing the church to stray away from sound doctrine. And this hasn't changed for us today. There are still church leaders who move away from teaching the gospel and lead their churches astray by doing this. We'll look at the example of Steve Chalk, former evangelical leader and reverend at Oasis Church in London. He's an advocate for blessing same-sex marriages and is now using his social media platform to encourage other Christians to do the same. The threat of false teachers is as real today and for us as it was in Crete. And that is why Paul is putting so much emphasis in these 4 verses on appointing the right people that, as verse 9 says, will encourage others by sound doctrine and refute those who oppose it. Well, refute means to deny opposers or strongly challenge. The ESV uses the word rebuke, which I think takes a step further. It's not just challenging, it's calling out. It's saying, no, that's not right. If you remember back to our first point, elders have the authority to rebuke those who oppose sound doctrine because they have the right characteristics to do it in a pastoral way. They have the authority to do that. Verse 9 also builds a picture of protection. So the elders have to protect the teaching of the trustworthy message within the church. They have to follow the trustworthy message, encourage the church based on it, and if anyone tries to contradict it, rebuke them. In sport, let's stick to what I know with the illustrations. In sport, teams need to balance offense and defense to achieve victory. Now, the World Cup is just around the corner. And if Gareth Southgate, England manager, if he puts all his focus on his attacking players and neglects the defence, well, then the team's going to be unbalanced. And even if they score, they're likely to concede more and lose the game. Very likely in England's case. But communicating the word of God and ensuring that sound doctrine is at the heart of the church needs both an offence in instructing and encouraging others and a defense in rebuking those to contradict it. You see, there's 2 sides of it, of this job of the elder. Paul wants elders appointed in Crete to carry out this management of the gospel in order, remember verse 1, for the sake of the faith of God's elect and their knowledge of the truth which leads to godliness. And for us, verse 9 is a clear instruction: hold firm to the gospel. The message of Jesus Christ dying on the cross for us and the instructions that he gives us to follow until he returns. Follow the example of godliness shown to us by our leaders in the church because God has appointed them. The main message that we've looked at is that we need to appoint elders that will lead the church to godliness and bless the fellowship. And we can see now why Paul has put this as of huge importance. Because by holding firm to the trustworthy message and having this at the center of the church, it will lead to godliness in our own lives and lead to God's elect being well led and well fed in the gospel truth. And we're going to end by looking at one more question on our tables and thinking of everything that we've heard, and hopefully this, you can challenge yourself and each others on this. So the last question is, what steps will you take to ensure that the gospel is at the heart of the way you live your life? So we're going to have a few minutes doing that, and then Rui's going to come up and lead us in communion.